So let's transition now to our panel. You've had the opportunity to hear from me, and I'm going to go ahead and invite to the stage our colleagues, Gary Cunningham and Nisha Patel. Let me just do their introductions. Nisha is a philanthropic, Nisha or Nisha?
Nisha.
Nisha. Nisha Patel is a philanthropic advisor to a range of donors, including individuals, families, private foundations, and community foundations. She is a national expert on social and economic mobility and philanthropy in the United States and leads her own consulting practice, powered by Shakti. Drawing on her more than 2 decades of cross-sector experience, leading and implementing initiatives to increase economic opportunities for families with low income. Welcome, Nisha. Nisha.
It's wonderful to be here.
And Gary Cunningham is the president and CEO of Prosperity Now, a national organization dedicated to advancing racial and ethnic economic justice. Gary is a recognized and respected expert on entrepreneurship, job creation, on racial wealth equity, housing, and economic development, and is a sought-after thought leader on building a more inclusive economy. Welcome, Gary, and thank you. So let's get started. Right. This is what the audience has been waiting for. Really, really excited and happy to have you both here, so thank you. So Nisha, I want to start with you. And I'd love it if you talk a little bit about a report that you authored. I think I remembered the presentation at
the ARC.
At the ARC, yes. I was just so excited and impressed by the work that you did, Restoring the American Dream. Can you talk about, you offered a definition for us in our conversation around what mobility really means. Could you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just spend a minute giving a little bit of context about that work. So I had the privilege of leading a few years ago a commission essentially called the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. And what I want to share is, and this is like a thread I think that'll run throughout the conversation, what you do is important, but how you go about it is perhaps more important. And there have been any number of commissions, right? Probably folks in this room have been part of them locally, nationally, internationally, that look at challenges to our society and how do we come up with solutions. But one of the things that was really different about this commission, a few things, it was incredibly diverse in all ways. So we had 24 members, racially diverse, diverse by political perspective, diverse by the experience people were coming from. Economists, psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, people running programs on the ground. But one of the things that I said, and I was happily working for the Obama administration when I was asked by the Gates Foundation to come and lead this commission, and I said, I'll do it. But the thing that's often missing in the how we do things is the voice of people who are impacted by the challenge, who's been locked out of economic opportunity. And yes, we certainly have people, experts, even like myself, who've experienced poverty in their lifetime, but poverty in 2022 looks really different than it did in the 60s and the 70s and 80s. So I said, let's do this, but we're gonna do this in a way that we talk to traditional experts, but we also talk to people who are experts in their own lives. And so we spent time in 30 different communities around the country breaking bread with people experiencing poverty, and by the way, compensating them for their time. Just like I get compensated to share my wisdom and my experience, so should a person who is economically struggling, who knows best what the challenges are and is best positioned to tell us, who often have economic privilege sitting at these tables, what the solutions look like. So with this commission and with these experiences, we said, okay, we're being asked to answer a question. We had one homework assignment for 2 years, and it was answer the question, what would it take to dramatically increase mobility? That question that you asked about, Tony, and what Tony just spoke about. What would it take? And so we looked at the best, yes, traditional research data and evidence, but we also spent, as I said, time talking to folks. And one of the things that became really clear is if we're trying to answer the question, how do you increase mobility, we first have to define mobility. Now, the way we have traditionally defined economic mobility in the US is a traditional definition that looks at economic success. Absolutely important. We have to talk about income, we have to talk about wealth and assets. That's foundational, it's fundamental. But we realized pretty quickly that if we said, well, let's just use the federal poverty guidelines, okay? So right now for a family of 4, that's just shy of $28,000. Can anybody in this room imagine a family of 4 in our region surviving, let alone thriving, on $28,000 a year? Not gonna happen. And we had some of the best economists in the country who said, well, we can come up with policies and we can model that and we can say, well, what does it take to get families to $28,001? So if you're making $28,001, are you all of a sudden not struggling? I think anybody in this room can tell you that's clearly not the case. So we said there has to be more to this, right? Absolutely, people need to have enough money. Yes, money is important, income is important, assets are important. But there's another piece. There's actually a couple of pieces. And what we said is, it's also, and this came from, and I know a colleague of Gary's as well, John Powell, who is a member of our commission, who's with the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. And he said this profound thing at that very first conversation. He said, here's the thing about poverty. It's not just about a lack of money. It's also about a lack of power, right? And sometimes people need the support to own their own power. It's not about me empowering another person, but it's creating space for people and creating shared power and shifting power. So people have agency, a say over what happens in their own lives, and a seat at the table around the trajectory of what happens in their community. And what was interesting is that perspective came from people with very different political points of view. So folks that know John's work, he's a progressive scholar, but we also had folks like Arthur Brooks, at that time was head of the American Enterprise Institute, right, up the street from here, coming from a more conservative point of view. Yet we had people from different perspectives kind of resonating around these same concepts of agency, of dignity. So that has to be a part of the equation. But we said there's also a third piece. And that is something, it's one of the reasons I love this region and I choose to live in this region and I've made it my home for the past 25 years. It is this idea of a sense of belonging, right? A sense of being valued in our community. And sociologists will talk about this often as social capital, but that piece has got to be there too. And so if it's true that mobility is about all 3 of those things, then how we measure our success has to measure all 3 of those things. And I think we're going to get into solutions. But as we propose a number of different solutions, we said, so we ought to be examining each of those solutions. And Tonya talked about some of them. Things like a guaranteed income. Things like child savings accounts and baby bonds, which I know Gary's organization does a lot of work on. Let's examine, are they helping folks increase their income and their wealth, but are they also baked into them having a sense of agency and creating belonging in community?
Thanks, Nisha. Thank you so much. I remember during the presentation of that report, a conversation about good jobs too, and at some point I'd love for you to loop back on kind of what that actually means.
Yeah.
There are lots of our colleagues out here who do work in workforce development. And I think that there's a connection, of course, between mobility and good jobs, but I'd love some discourse about what that actually means. Okay, how about now? Awesome, thank you. I don't know if there's a way to turn the mic up a little bit. Awesome, and since we have a little bit of an intermission, I want to welcome our colleagues who have joined by live stream. So thank you for joining us for this conversation this morning. Gary, I'd love for you to, you can jump in wherever you want to.
Sure.
And I want to acknowledge the successful launch of the Black Wealth Data Center, which we are all super excited about. And I know this audience cares about impact, about data, and just having a place where the research is already done so that we don't have to do a lot of original, sort of research to make the case. But you can start wherever you want to, because I know you have a lot to share and to offer.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here today. I spent 10 years of my life in philanthropy as the vice president of the Northwest Area Foundation, and then another 5 years with the Minneapolis Community Foundation. So I deeply understand this work. And I've had to change my mind several times in that experience over this time about what works. Because I went in with some assumptions about, I know this, I grew up poor, I understand it, we can fix this, and found that some of the assumptions that I was making weren't the correct assumptions about how to change the dynamics within community, and then how to change dynamics of the power structures within community. And so I had the opportunity, and I call it my time of falling in love with America. And I fell in love with America by traveling many hundreds of thousands of miles in rural places, in native nations, and in urban areas throughout this country. And what I found was that people really want to help each other. In this community, and I've only been here 3 years, so I'm an interloper at the moment, but what I found here, just in the local community, of people really reaching out to help each other in need during this pandemic that we've all gone through. People actually sacrificing something of themselves to help others. I've seen people come back after getting their graduate degrees to communities that were struggling. And this is what philanthropy is about. It's about love of people. That's what really this mission that you have here in this room is. And so I say that not because I'm an expert, but because it was a learning journey. And I came in really funding all kind of programs on the ground. I think we gave out over a 10-year period, probably $300 million or so. And what we learned, we actually stepped back and said, what did we learn from this work? And what we learned was that at times we weren't really strategic about our grant making. We were actually funding great projects all over the place, but we had kind of like a beauty contest. People would walk in front of us, they'd give us their pitch, and then we'd fund them, but we weren't thinking strategically about it. Meaning, we weren't thinking about the communities that we were impacting, nor were we thinking about the ecosystems that operate within those communities. In each community, there's an ecosystem that's operating. And rather than, we shifted our gears from funding individual folks and then went on a long journey, and I came in at the end of that journey of really funding communities. And we got some traction around that work, but we also then learned some other things. We learned that not necessarily that you come in and promise people something and then not deliver. Have any of you experienced that? Or that we had expectations that weren't realistic for the community that we were engaged in. And so we created, we're very smart people. We created a theory of change. We had all of this kind of scientific data around what would happen. And then we found out we were dealing with human beings. And human beings actually don't operate according to the economic forecast. Many of us don't make those rational, quote unquote, decisions about our lives. We make decisions based on what's good for our families, what's good for the community that we reside in, which may not follow that economic model. And so why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I'm in recovery. I'm a philanthropoid that actually is in recovery because I started learning that you really had to invest upstream in order to address the issues downstream. That you couldn't just invest in the food shelf. You actually had to invest in what are the asset building programs that people actually can rely on over time. Meaning that we actually stopped focusing specifically on trying to deal with the immediate acute need, which is heartbreaking because people are actually suffering on a day-to-day basis. But we actually started funding upstream. We started funding CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, in part because what we saw is that we needed to create economic base within these communities, and there wasn't any transfer of money. So in many of the communities, even here in this area, which is very dense and very populated, there's not a circulation of capital in these communities that actually moves several times within that community. Money goes in the community, some money gets paid, and then it goes immediately out. In part because the financial institutions there don't actually reinvest in the communities, and or they don't have the businesses in those communities to actually stabilize those communities. You mentioned good jobs. And I'll just fast forward this a little bit, but we just finished a study for the Gates Foundation where we looked at businesses of color across the country, and we're asking the question, are these good jobs, right? And I've worked with entrepreneurs for many years, but what we found in this particular instance was that and at the same time we were doing this study, Harvard was doing a similar study for Gates on medium and large-sized businesses. Blew us away. Blew us totally away, because what we found is good jobs is something that people actually, I thought, well, you know, if you have benefits and you got, you know, these other fringe things that happen, that you got a good job. But many of the people that work for entrepreneurs of color, 85, 90%, believe in their employer, and they believe that their job is a good job. Well, why is that? Right? They can't provide the same benefits as everybody, et cetera. The reason why it was is because that employer, they had trust. They had a relationship that was flexible, somebody that understood them and actually could work with them. Blew us totally away. So when we compared the data, same survey, the jobs in communities of color where, you know, people can't pay as much, but they have some other intangible things that are so important to their lifestyle. Now, you know, in part, now I'm going to go back again and say, you know, in part for me, this journey that I've been on actually led me to this work that actually says that we can't just focus on the programs that mitigate the effects of a broken system. We really have to focus on the systemic issues that that community has, and that the gap that we're trying to fill is gigantic. Did you guys realize how big this gap is? Sandy Doherty talks about it in his book, From Here to Equality. He talks about it as a $7 trillion to $42 trillion gap. That's a big gap. Do people understand what you're saying when you say you want to close the gap? And that's what my business is to close the gap. That means you're going to have to do something pretty disruptive within the current structure and system in order to change the conditions. I'm going to stop here because I could go on, and leave some intrigue for you all as to what are the solutions, because they are out here. They are doable. But let me leave you with this last thing. So why don't we say we're all in a department store, and we all, our opportunity occurs on the 3rd floor. So everybody's trying to get to the 3rd floor. Now, some of us in this room were born on the 3rd floor. I don't want you to raise your hand. Where opportunity was plenty, right? But many might be on the 2nd floor. They might be on the main floor. They need different vehicles to get to that opportunity. Some can take the stairway. Some of us can walk up the stairs. Some of us can take the escalator. And then some of us run up the down escalator, and then they wonder, well, you know, you're all tired out. And they say, well, why don't all your people run up the down escalator? Which is part of the pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. But then there are folks that are in wheelchairs. They're not similarly situated, and they can't use those conveyances. So they have to use a separate conveyance. They have to take an elevator. Now, you don't hear anybody saying, don't build the elevator, right? Have you ever heard anybody say, don't build an elevator? In part because we all benefit from that elevator being built, and that person in the wheelchair can get to the 3rd floor. So we need different structures and different conveyances or different strategies to opportunity to get everybody to the 3rd floor. And that really has to be part of what we have to do. We don't want to have a zero sum where we're taking things away from people because they were born on the 3rd floor. That doesn't make any sense, right? But we do need to understand that we need to actually distribute things so that other people can actually get to the 3rd floor too. Because the 3rd floor is unsustainable unless all of us can get to the 3rd floor. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So you've opened up the can of worms here. There was a really good debate on our prep call about this notion of zero-sum gain. And I'd love for us to spend a little time here just for a little while, because I think it's important. Nisha, maybe we can just kind of come back to you to just offer some reflections about, you know, when we talk about investing in economic strategies, mobility strategies, is there a zero-sum gain? I mean, or, you know, what's your view?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I could probably take it in a couple different directions. I will start with the idea of abundance. Like, that's just a philosophy I have. I actually believe in this country, so I do tend to agree with Gary. We have enough, but the challenge is how is wealth being distributed in this country, right? We have massive differences with people who are at the bottom end of the spectrum and people at the very top. So, when I think about publicly financed programs, I mean, it's a zero-sum game in the sense that it's right now, it's a finite pie. But there are ways to grow that pie, and the ways we grow that pie, public dollars, right, is through the tax system. And so we have to have a more just tax code. Now, that does mean that some people who are making a whole lot more, right? If you're a billionaire, you're making a whole lot more. Perhaps you should be taxed at a higher rate to pay for some of the things that benefit society as a whole, right? I'm a person, I don't have any biological children of my own, but I'm very happy to pay for things like education. Why? Because that's a benefit to society as a whole. So, I do think some people are going to have to pay a little bit more if what we want is this just and equitable society. Now, at the same time, there are some ways that we can grow the pie. So if you look at GDP, traditional measure that economists like to look at, there's actually ways that we can grow that. And one of the ways that we can do that is looking at who's not counted, who's not being tapped, who's not being able to access their full potential. And one of the fastest growing sectors in our economy is the care economy. When I talk about the care economy, what do I mean by that? Talking about folks that are caring for young children, caring for our elders, caring for folks with disabilities, right? And experts in this field, Ai-jen Poo, who's one of the leaders of this movement and who was part of that commission I talked about, talks about as care work as the work that makes all other work possible. Who is doing that care work? Is largely women and largely women of color. And some of that work is completely unpaid. Folks have their first shift during the day, and then they've got their second shift where they're caring for family members. None of that work is counted in our GDP, and hardly any of it is publicly financed. And so then we have folks that are in the paid sector doing that work, working for very low wages. They are taking care of our most precious family members, yet they're not being valued in that way in the labor market. And what if we started to value folks that way for both that unpaid and underpaid labor? What would that do to our productivity? What would that do to a redistribution of resources more equitably? And during the pandemic, we had this moment, right? We had this moment of recognition that those workers and those folks were essential. Yeah. And by the way, we applied that to our grocery store workers and our restaurant workers, who I was writing about as essential prior to the pandemic, and I still see as essential, right? It became very clear during the pandemic. So if it's true that care workers and food service workers are essential, why aren't we compensating them in that way? Why don't we have things, and what if we did? What if we had things like universal family care? What if we had universal paid leave? What if everyone was paid a fair wage for their labor? Then we would be growing the pie. We would have more abundance. So I think there's a way to get there, but it does mean we probably need a different tax structure to help finance some of these things that ultimately benefit all of us.
Thanks, Nisha. Gary.
So I'll just say, Nisha and I don't always agree, but on this we do. You've got to think about what public policy has created. Because in part, what we've created is through our public policy is the system that we have today. Most people don't realize that in 1960, African-American families had the highest marriage rate in the country. Did you know that? Marriage rate. The highest marriage rate in the country, black people had the highest marriage rate. Didn't know that. Well, we actually created a public policy which had good intent and was a compromise, which was called welfare or aids to families with dependent children or whatever your term is locally here, TANF, et cetera. And that program had a clause in it that no men could live in the household. And so I grew up on welfare and watched social workers come by our house to make sure that a man wasn't in the house. So when you create, an economic unit, which marriage is part of, and then you actually create dynamics within that where work disappeared in the 1970s and 80s, where my grandfather moved to Minnesota for a job and to get out of Jim Crow and Klan activities in Oklahoma. He took care of a family of 6 on $9,000 a year. It had a factory job, would have had a car, and et cetera. And it was a very holistic family that I grew up in part. And you look at that change that's happened over the intervening years with the war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on black people in this country, and you end up in a situation where you have black families black women having the least likelihood of being married in our society. Now, marriage has changed in the definition of marriage, so I'm not trying to hold up some traditional value of marriage, but I am saying that we know that children do better when they're in a 2-parent household because of the income, et cetera. So we know this, right? Meaning all the data shows, and even Rod Chetty's work on poverty shows that having fathers in the home matter. I did a lot of work in the early 2000s on black men, and I started off in that looking at it saying, what can society do to help these men do better, right? Because of the incarceration rates are very high for African American men, et cetera. I walked away thinking differently because what I was doing is undervaluing their particular contribution, and I was looking at it in the same way someone externally would. When I started really looking at the power of these men to transform their own lives, I started changing my mind, but also lifting these men up in terms of what they are and who they are within our society. And we started seeing huge changes happen when we started looking at our values in relationship to these men, right, which are an integral part of what happens with women. I don't want to go on, you can interrupt me. We took 300 families. I ran a large social service agency. I have a lot of jobs, but I ran a large social service agency. We took 300 women, and we started working with those women on a 5-year project to look at how we can change their economic circumstances. And one of the things we found was that they'd start working together, they'd be doing all right, and then the men would return from prison, and the whole family would get disrupted, right, again, and so they'd start over. And so the start over process would happen again and again in these women's and their families' lives. And so what we started doing is say, we got to work on these men, right? We can't just work on the women, we actually have to work on the men. So we have to really take a holistic approach to how we address this. Well, how does this relate to what you're doing, right? When you're looking at the statistics of these communities that you're focused on, you really have to take a holistic approach and look at the whole family, as opposed to just looking at one side of the family and think you're going to fix the equation. You actually have to work on both sides of that equation. And part of that has to be about what is that nurturing that child is getting at home, right? And I'll say another job I had, I was associate superintendent of schools for Minneapolis Public Schools for a little while. And I found out a lot, right? I found out that, hey, if a child doesn't come to school ready to learn, it's really hard to get them to learn after that fact. So the interventions actually need to happen very early in that child's life. Head Start, other programs, quality daycare and childcare is so critical for that child's maturation. So, you think these are little things, but these are structural things that are in our current system where that child doesn't get the same type of attention as another child might be because of the economic conditions that they grew up in. So these things matter. They matter a lot.
I just appreciated the opening part when you referred to some of the rules that penalize families as they are sort of looking to support families on the one hand, but are creating barriers, the barriers that I spoke about in my remarks. particularly around TANF, and noting that a man can't be in the home. What I'm offering is that, and I wonder if we could just speak to it just a little bit, particularly as we're talking about shifting to solutions, is even as we are launching all of these pilots around economic strategies, we have to look at the policy environment. We're offering actually a disservice if we just do the investment in sort of the programmatic level, and we're not looking at what are the policies that we need to, I'm using the word rewrite, so that families are not penalized for the kinds of things that we want to see that will help them to make it and thrive. I just want to make sure that we put a circle around that point, that pilots alone, outside of a broader agenda around both the policy environment to either scale the pilot so that more families in specific communities can benefit, and rewrite or remove policies that are creating a disservice to families have to be shifted as well. I want us to make sure that we have time to talk about solutions. We've shared a few that we are going to be pursuing. I know that there are others, as I said, we don't have all of the answers. But I'd love for you to talk about in your experiences, what have you seen as some of the strategies that are happening around the country that are working? And what are some of the evidence that might support those?
Yeah, I actually want to pick up just where you were starting, Tony, and something that you shared in your remarks. You were talking about like the programs are important. It's important to get proof of concept. But and Gary mentioned this in his remarks. But if we want to get to scale, we've got to talk about policy. We've got to talk about changing systems. So something that you mentioned, Tony, and I know the Community Foundation and many folks in this room are actually funding, is in the space of guaranteed income. And I do a lot of work in that space, advise clients in that space. As Tony mentioned, we have over 100 guaranteed income pilots around the country. I'm getting an audience member telling me to slow down, but I know we're also tight on time.
Yeah,
so.
we are.
So over 100 pilots, and so guaranteed income, right? For folks familiar with this concept, I'm seeing nodding heads. Okay, so dollars without strings attached, and why is that important? It goes back to that definition of mobility that I mentioned when I talked about let's have programs and policies that embody all of these pieces. So it's money. Yes, it's helping families, helping individuals to increase their income. But cash provides the ultimate agency and autonomy. If you give somebody food stamps or SNAP, that can only be used for food. You can't use that to purchase diapers, right? You can't use that to pay your rent. You give somebody a housing voucher, you can't use that to pay for medicine. You can't use that to pay for school shoes. Cash provides the ultimate flexibility to families, and by the way, to nonprofits when you're doing your giving. Flexible, general, multi-year general operating support, right? That's what nonprofits need. Never miss a chance to get that in. But going back to this idea of pilots, I think that's an important space for philanthropy to be in. Philanthropy is the innovation capital in the social sector, so philanthropy should absolutely be funding those pilots. But once you get to a point with something where we've got 100 pilots up and running, largely funded by philanthropy, the next piece, and there's an entire movement, I'm part of a guaranteed income community of practice. The focus is on how do we go from pilots to policy now? And so, Tonya, you asked about the evidence. It's wonderful that philanthropy can do that. Philanthropy can take risks with our capital that maybe doesn't make sense for government to do. And we now have proof of concept. And by the way, we've had a lot of evidence from publicly funded programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, like the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is essentially a guaranteed income for people that live in Alaska, that they receive annually. We've got evidence that this works. But two of the more modern day pilots that we have around this, one that I'll mention is in Stockton, the SEED demonstration, which provided $500 a month to individuals over a 2-year period. It's actually still going. Randomized control trial, so the same kind of experimental design that's used in clinical research, right? And it found that, people have concerns like, well, gosh, if you just give people money, will they stop working? Actually, it found that part-time work increased. It found that people were actually able to quit jobs to get better jobs because they had the time and the space to do that work, to investigate, to do the interviewing. And one of the biggest findings is improvements you talked about, health equity, Tony, and the new fund that the Community Foundation has. huge increases in mental health. One of the quotes from the researchers was, this is better than Prozac when it comes to so much of people's anxiety and depression is actually driven by financial insecurity. So there's a real link there we have to look at. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Magnolia Mothers Trust, which is actually the longest standing modern guaranteed income program in the country. Started in 2018 in Jackson, Mississippi. This is a program that provides $1,000 a month to Black mothers living in subsidized housing for 12 months. And that program was designed and shaped by the perspectives, I talked about this early on, of those mothers, right? Aisha Nandora, who's the pioneer who started this program, did it in partnership with the women by asking them, well, what is it that you would need? What would make a difference? And folks are strapped for cash, flexible cash. We don't have, and in Mississippi, Gary mentioned less than 1% of eligible families are getting access to that program. And so that is vital in giving families a boost and a leg up. But also when you look at the outcomes of that program, there was a 2-generational effect. There was an impact on the moms who, again, were able to access better jobs, able to further their education, but you see those impacts in the second generation. You see it with the children. You see better educational outcomes for children, and we've got this evidence across programs. And so we know we know it makes a difference. Now's the time to say then exactly what Tonya said. How does that translate into policy? And we actually had a moment in time last year in 2021 where Congress, as a result of, I think, some of this evidence, but also people's eyes being opened up in the pandemic to the importance of not just emergency cash, but having access to cash, greatly expanded the child tax credit. This is, in my 25 years of doing this work, one of the best impacts we've seen from a policy in terms of decreasing child poverty. So the child tax credit was expanded and made available to families with very low income or no income that didn't have access before, and made available on a monthly basis. And what that did was reduce child poverty by 30% on a monthly basis. There are very few programs that have that kind of impact. Unfortunately, Congress expanded that program for 1 year. And that expansion ended at the end of 2021. So this, again, goes back to what I was saying about having a more just tax code. We're willing to do it in certain moments, but we have short attention spans. So if we can keep our focus there, and this becomes a long-term policy, that would have a bigger impact in this region than almost anything else that we could do.
Thanks, Nisha. Gary, do you want to chime in here before we get a couple
I will,
of questions from
and
the audience?
I'll get to what you're doing specifically, but I want to start by saying we've been trying to get by on the cheap in terms of our investment in the social safety net. If you look at all of our European colleagues and neighbors, they put a lot more investment into their social structure going back many years. And so we've actually, to some degree, been trying to get by on the cheap when providing these basic things that people need: a home, health care, issues of transportation. We have actually not been paying what is necessary to build a sustainable society. So let's start there, and you can look at Capital and Ideology or any of these major works that look at economic inequality worldwide, and everybody knows that the United States has not paid its fair share in terms of ensuring that each of our citizens has the ability and the right to live with dignity in our society. So that's number one. I'd say number two is working on multiple levels. So Gunnar Myrdal, some of you might have heard of him, some of you fossils in the room like me, he was commissioned by the Ford Foundation in the 1940s to actually do a study that was forerunner to the Civil Rights Movement on the conditions of African Americans. And what he found in this huge tome was that it's not one thing, it's multiple issues that impact the Black community. I'd say his work is still relevant today, as relevant as it was back then. So that if we just say we're gonna just do jobs, we're gonna just do healthcare, we actually have to work on these things simultaneously in order for it to have an impact on communities of color, particularly the Black community today. And then finally, I'd say we know what works. There's been a plethora of research about what works. We know what works. We don't want to pay for what works, but we clearly know what works. Some of the things that Nisha has put out there, clearly the child tax credit, which we're fighting every day to get back is critical. But this issue of children's savings account that our organization's been working on for 30 years is critical, because we know that an investment in a child at a young age actually pays off in huge dividends down the road. And in fact, that child that gets a child savings account, the data shows that they have a 4 times greater chance of matriculating through college by just that investment, somebody giving them hope. And you can't put a quantitative measure on hope. But the fact that somebody believed in me, right, is the reason I'm sitting here today talking to you. It's because somebody believed. Somebody, actually, all of you in this room are believing in these children by investing in them. But we want to even take that further, because we're working on baby bonds. How many of you have heard of baby bonds? Raise your hand. So if you haven't heard of baby bonds is like an accelerated, bigger child savings account. And what it would do, we believe, and we've been working with Derek Hamilton, one of the creators of the baby bonds, that we could close the wealth gap within a generation. Now, our data shows that it would take 200 years, if we do what we're doing now, for black people to equal the wealth in America that whites have today. 200 years. Do you have 200 years? I don't have 200 years. So we have to actually work big and bold. This country was built on several things. The New Deal, everybody know what that is? The New Deal built the white middle class in this country and left people of color behind, right? I mean, this is the reality of why we end up in these situations that we're in, is that people of color couldn't participate at the same rate in these wealth building programs that were created to build the white middle class in America. So we actually need a bigger inflection point, and that's why baby bonds falls in the center of our agenda, because it's big enough to actually solve the problem. We can't do it with a program here or there. The next thing I'd say, you have to work on building the infrastructure, and Nisha mentioned this, of the nonprofit community that you're working with. Many of them, and we've done this research all over the country, we've worked over 100 and plus organizations, we have found that without building their capacity to actually do what they say they're going to do, you're going to continue to have issues of delivery and impact. And so everybody in here may not be of the same political persuasion, but we know one thing. Larry Jacobs did a book some years ago called Class Wars. And it focused on this issue of what is the agreement around this issue of economic inequality in America. And they looked at polls going back 30 years. And what they found was that there is an unwritten assumption with most Americans that, in fact, that if you work hard, you do the right thing, you should be able to have economic mobility. That's not me saying that. That is what Americans have said. They agree that if you work hard, and that there is a role for government to intervene in markets that are failing people, like the housing market. So there is a broad-based agreement within this country, even though you don't believe it today, that, in fact, if we invest in people, we invest in the dignity of work, we invest in the returns to skills for work that is accomplished, that nothing beats the greatest social program in the world is a job. Somebody having a job, bringing home pay, and I've seen it, right? I've seen it in reservation communities. I've seen it in urban areas. That dignity that comes with providing for who you are. So we need not only jobs, but we need asset building so that when you work, you're actually moving up the economic ladder. All of you in this room are dedicated part of your lives. The reason you're here is because you want to make a difference for others. The work that has been outlined here, I think, is at the cutting edge. And Prosperity Now stands ready to work with you hand in hand on making this happen. So thank you for what you're doing. Just want to thank you for this great work that you're doing. Applaud yourself. Give yourself a round of applause for the work that you're doing to make a difference for this community. It really matters. Thank you.
That's scary. I want to make sure that we have a chance to just test to see if there are any audience questions. We'll take 2 questions at the same time if you'd like to pose them and give a shot at some responses.
My name is Janine McKay. I'm a member at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, and we have been deeply involved with issues of development. We have a 60-year one-on-one tutoring program for DC kids. We need tutors Thursday night. That's your night.
All right.
You will learn more than the kids will ever learn, and they learn a lot. But what I wanted to just say to you, when we talk about abundance, we also, and we've got a lot of it, but the thing is, are we willing to risk it? Are we willing to risk it? Because we've got a lot to learn, and we've got to understand that when we fail, we will learn. So I think that's the challenge that we have. I'd just like to remind you a couple of things. Number one, the caregivers. Who are most the caregivers? They're immigrants, enough said. Leading cause of bankruptcy, health bills, because of our health system.
Absolutely.
Okay? So that's the kind of thing. I'm just so glad to be here. I hear of your interest in the churches, because
Yes.
I think we need to be thinking about the unions, because that issue of pay is many times issues of payment that unions need the power to do. So thank you very much, and I yield my phone.
Thank you. Thank you for raising that issue of medical debt. We talk about some of the work that we aspire to do on the asset side, but there's also the elimination of medical debt, of criminal legal fees. We have to do both in order to help families to move to economic sustainability. Yes, Lindsay.
Thanks, Tonya and Nisha and Gary. Really appreciate the discussion today. I wanted to ask particularly about philanthropy's role. You talked, Nisha, about the ability of philanthropy to fund pilots to take more risks than government may be able to do at times. I'd be interested, Nisha and Gary, if y'all can talk about other special powers that philanthropy in particular may have in this space, either strategically or tactically, to advance these solutions. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would say, in particularly institutions like community foundations, I have the privilege of working with many community foundations around the country. With Tonya's leadership and your board and your fund holders and partners that are here, you have incredible power, not just to the risk taking that I talked about with the innovation capital, but the convening power to be that bridge to bring together government, corporate, nonprofit sectors to work on solutions together. And one of the things that I didn't share earlier, when I talked about the commission I had the privilege of leading, it won't surprise anyone in this room, we were very clear there's not just one solution, Gary said this in his remarks too, but there's also not just one sector that's going to solve this challenge of economic mobility and lack of access to opportunity, of folks being locked out of that opportunity. It's actually going to take firing on all cylinders, firing on all sectors, I would like to say. And I think community foundations in particular are well positioned to bring those sectors together. So taking some risks where government can't, but also helping to show government the way, partnering with government as the community foundation had, because one of the projects I had the privilege of working on over the past year was with a group of community foundations and private national foundations, where we created a fund called the Co-op Fund, the Community Outreach and Opportunity Pooled Fund, which was focused on the child tax credit. And we saw community foundations as the bridge to trusted community members who could get to, someone mentioned like new immigrant communities, faith-based communities. Churches are often part of that on-the-ground network. But how do national funders or philanthropists that's looking across the country, or it's not their day job, know how to get to those community foundations are a big part of that answer. Because it may not be Tonya's her small but mighty team doing it alone, but they're in the community and they're networked with the grassroots groups in the community that can be those trusted messengers. So when we do have a crisis, we saw that during the pandemic, they know what needs to happen with mutual aid. but also when we have an opportunity, when we have a federal policy like an expanded child tax credit, being that conduit to get to those last mile organizations. So that's another really important role I want to lift up.
Thanks, Nisha. Gary, is there a role connecting this philanthropy question for philanthropy in the entrepreneurship ecosystem?
Absolutely. So let me start by saying, there's a book out some years ago called that focused on the passing gear. They called philanthropy at that time, and I think people have heard of that. But this idea that philanthropy has done some great things in this country. I mean, the whole idea of our public hospitals, our libraries, there's all this wealth that has got created in this community. And I don't mean monetary wealth. I mean wealth of interaction and community building that has happened all over this country because of this great work that philanthropy has done. At the same time, philanthropy has done harm. Meaning, I just remember walking into places where, there'd be burnout buildings. Well, that was so-and-so foundation was here then. And, that was another foundation that was here then. And so this question of sustainability, of investing so that you're really creating sustainability is part of the issue when I talk about ecosystem development. And not looking at just each individual organization, but looking at what's happening in that ecosystem. So a couple of things that philanthropy can do. Number one, it can actually convene people from cross sectors and actually bring people together to actually talk about this issue. There was a lot of work done by a group called SFB that worked on collective impact. I think some of you might have heard of that model, collective impact model. And the whole idea of that model was to actually align resources so that you could get at impact. Now, there's still some of that going on to this day, but a part of the struggle is aligning all of these different interests. And at a community foundation, as somebody has been involved, you got a lot of different interests to try to align. Yeah. Meaning, people want to just fund the arts, or they just want to fund education, or they just want to fund X. And so getting at that question of alignment. Now, on entrepreneurship, and we do a lot of work on entrepreneurship at Prosperity Now, one of the things that we do know is that by investing in ecosystem of support organizations to support entrepreneurs of color. So here we've got a great opportunity. Women of color, particularly Latina and Black women, are the fastest growing entrepreneurs in this country. Did people realize that? That they are growing businesses like hotcakes, but they're not supported. So what do they need? They need capital access. They need technical assistance, and they need access to markets. These are the three things they need. And we know that those women that are going out being entrepreneurs are changing the conditions within their community. A study at the University of Washington, 10-year panel study on income, not assets, basically showed that in a 10-year period, if you had a Black family and a white family, the gap was wide. Those families that actually, on average, had an entrepreneur in that family almost completely closed the income gap. Robert Farley at University of California, Santa Cruz, probably the eminent person on Black and brown businesses, did a study that showed that adding an entrepreneur to a Black family increases the assets on average about 600%. Women, just white women, another 200-300%, if family. Latinos, 60, 70, 80% increase in their assets. So we know that entrepreneurship matters. And people of color hire disproportionately more people of color than anyone else. So if you're actually going to get at creating an economic and economy in these communities, you really have to, in part, support entrepreneurship as one of the pathways to address the issue of people getting into the labor market and of people doing well. Home ownership rates of entrepreneurs of color are almost on par with that of whites, where nationally they're about 41%, and here they're even worse. Here in this area. So I am a full proponent of entrepreneurship as a vehicle to get there. But there's another piece. You also need data and information. If you don't have accurate data and information that you're relying on to make your decisions, then you're really going to continue to follow the pattern of the past. And so that's why we've created the Black Wealth Data Center, is to have one reliable source that you can go to that actually tells you the story about what's happening in your community and the solutions around how to address those things. And some of the solutions are somewhat surprising, like asking people in the community what they want, as opposed to you assuming with your education, et cetera, that you know how much better than them what they need. And so these are critical things. So I'd say for me, the work that I'm doing is a continuation of the work of the civil rights movement in this country. This is the continuation of Dr. King's work. And that work, when he ended his life, he ended it fighting for economic justice in this country. So the work that each of you are doing to make this country a better place by your investments in this community matter. And we need to take it to the next level so that everyone, no matter what their race, no matter what their color, can actually thrive in this country of plenty. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you so much, Nisha. Thank you, Gary, for just offering a fine point on some of the strategies and the plans and the ambitions that our foundation has landed on. Like I said, we do not have all the answers. Our experts have lots of answers, and so we're really, really pleased that they're able to share them with us. But we really look forward to working in continued partnership with many of you, in new partnership with others of you as we look to deepen our work and expand our vision for economic justice in this region. I want to say a huge thank you to all of our fund holders, all of our partners in this room who trust us, who work hand in hand with us every single day to make this region better for everyone. Again, thank you all very much. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to the months ahead and spending more time in person together. Be well, everyone. Thank you very much.